Yep. Thank you, everyone. Super quick about me, pretty much exactly the same as the intro. Hardware hacker, reverse engineer, security researcher, and sometimes even a forward engineer. As of now, I'm a former undergraduate student at the University of Michigan. And at my time there, I was asked to be part of the SGX.fail team, who was looking into some real-world applications that utilize SGX, secure enclave technology, and see what we can find out about them. So before we get into all that, I want to take a quick detour and do a history lesson on DRM in movies and discs, starting with CSS. Not that CSS. This CSS is the content scramble system. It was introduced back in '96, developed by Matsushita, who's now Panasonic. And it was primarily the DRM scheme of DVD. And their main goal was to prevent just someone putting a disk into a drive, doing a one-to-one bit copy, and getting another good decryptable DVD out the other side. And as a byproduct of that, that also encourages the manufacturers of both software and the actual drives themselves to go through the official licensing processes and not just come up with their own solutions. So the content on the disk is encrypted with the M6 block cipher, which is a pretty weak cipher. It has a multi-keyed system, though, so there's a whole bunch of keys, like authentication keys, title keys, disk keys, player keys, and something called a disk key block, which stores effectively like hashes or encrypted versions of the keys. You don't actually have to understand how this works, just keep some of these names in mind, because we'll see them come up again and again. And the actual parts on the disk that are flagged as holding the copyrighted content that we want to protect are prevented by the drive itself from being read by the host until an authentication handshake is performed. And there's a limited revocation support with the disk key block system. So if someone is doing bad things and leaks drive keys, host keys, a certificate, then there is a mechanism implemented by the CSS scheme to revoke that user. So what went wrong? Well, at the time, the US still had export controls on strong cryptography, over 40 bits. And the M6 cipher itself had some mathematical cryptographic faults. But turns out that actually didn't matter, because even in the late 90s, your 450 megahertz Pentium 3 could brute force the key in like 18 seconds. And the revocation system itself only had limited tolerance to leaks. So when a tool by the name of DCSS was published in around the late 90s, then that could effectively generate the entire keying system, and the revocation system was rendered completely ineffective, since you can't revoke everyone or your scheme doesn't work anymore. And yeah, by '99 it was completely broken, and they've given up. So that brings us to AACS, or V1, which is the Advanced Access Content System. And it was the response to the breakage of CSS. And they formed a new coalition called the AACS Licensing Authority. And they want this to be developed in time for the release of the upcoming HD, DVD, and Blu-ray high-definition formats. The specifications are actually released publicly in April of 2005, which is kind of surprising for a DRM scheme. And they were actually deployed to devices in 2006. And now that the export control ban was lifted, you could actually use strong cryptography. So it made a lot of use of AES-128, SHA-1, the standard strong cipher suites. And it's a very complex scheme. But again, we see media key blocks, another revocation model that's significantly more robust this time, mutual drive host authentication again, and something called trader tracing, which we'll get to in a little bit. And yeah, the whole scheme, according to the official white paper, looks a little bit something like this. And again, it's quite complex, but I'll try to give an overview of just the parts you need to understand for now. And again, similar to CSS, AACS works in a key hierarchy. The video content itself is encrypted with a randomly generated title key that's unique per title, which is almost like a release of a movie, but you might have like the same movie mastered in different times or with different regions that would count as a different title. The title key is then wrapped and encrypted with the volume unique key, which is generated by combining the volume ID with the media key. And the volume ID is just a little value that's read off a special area in the disk that the drive will actually only give to you after you pass the drive host authentication process. So that's how they enforce having to not only have licensed hosts, but also licensed drives. And the media key is derived from a processing key And this processing key, should you be able to obtain it, could theoretically decrypt every single physical disk that's been pressed up to the point of it being revoked and having new disks being mastered, since you can't revoke something that physically exists. And to actually get a processing key, it must be derived by the player when you try to play a movie using its set of device keys and something called the media key block, which, hey, that sounds pretty familiar. So what is this media key block? It's the mechanism that they implement to allow only unrevoked devices to derive a processing key using their set of device keys. And these device keys can be revoked when you issue a new MKB version. So like we said, this requires mastering new physical media, but leaking a processing key will permanently lock disks. So, oops. The way the actual revocation model works is also quite mathematically complex, but it's based on something called a subset difference tree method, and it was invented in 2001, and that is the official diagram that they give in the white paper, which you might see is not that helpful. We've definitely spent a lot of time staring at that, trying to make heads or tails of it. But you can kind of think of it like a binary tree where every node is a 128-bit value. The left and right subnodes can be derived from the parent node through a robust one-way function, which is effectively a hash, but they don't use a hash like SHA or MD5. They actually came up with a new hash called AASg3, which is based on AES, and it does 3 rounds using a hard-coded seed, just because they wanted to. A certain parent node could have a third center node, which is, would be denoted by a special value, which instead of continuing down and making more levels of the tree, you would actually stop there, and when you get that center node, that 128-bit node label is your processing key. And a device key, or the device key set, is just the set of node labels that they give to you at very certain points in the tree. And each device has a set of device keys, but the whole system of devices has some overlap of the total possible device keys that's computed in a way where every device has a lot of shared overlap, but is guaranteed to have exactly one unique leaf key at the very bottom of the tree that no other device in the scheme has. And this is how you can actually implement per device-based revocation, since that's actually what this triangle is showing, that the device at the very bottom of the tree, because it has the device key node at that level in white at the very bottom, and you can't invert the hash, there's no way to travel from the bottom of the tree back up the tree along that specific path. And every single device has a unique path from the bottom to the top. So this is weird. So I tried to make a little bit of an easier way to visualize this. So suppose we have this smaller subtree and 2 devices, A in white and B in purple. So let's say we give A its unique device key as at the very bottom of the tree as that white circle, and we give device B its own unique device key at the bottom of the tree in purple. Well, if we give A these device keys, it can derive all subkeys shaded in yellow. But notice again, there exists that path from its own unique white device key to the root of the tree, along which it cannot derive any keys. So similarly, device B, given that set of keys, has its own unique path from the base of the tree to the root, along which it cannot derive any nodes. So if we want to revoke a device, like let's say we want to revoke device B, we can encrypt an entry in the MKB with its device key, which is a little bit counterintuitive. But because you're encrypting the processing key with that device key circle in red, every device in the system except for device B can end up in that node. Now, let's say we want to revoke both A and B. We can choose the subset difference of both systems and find the least common node that neither device can derive and use that to encrypt a key. And this is a little bit more complex in practice because AACS uses multiple subtrees for efficient, non-contiguous revocation. And there's a very easy way to think about that. Just imagine some 4-dimensional pseudo-binary trees. But Also regarding revocation, disks contain revocation lists for host and drive certificates. And in a little bit of a sneaky move, they came up with a scheme where if you inserted, the certificate revocation list exists on disks, and if you insert a disk into a drive with an older version of the revocation list, the drive will actually install that revocation list into its NVRAM, so if you get revoked, well, don't play your movie because that will revoke your drive and now you can't watch anything. And there's more crypto, there's a lot more details. Unfortunately, we don't have time right now. But if you are interested, then that is the actual release of the AACS Common Cryptographic Elements by AACS-LA, and that's the document that contains in-depth how all this crypto works. So this is very complex and obviously relies on a lot of strong crypto, so what could have gone wrong? Well, on December 27, 2006, a forum poster by the name of MusliX64 made this legendary post, releasing backup HD DVD. So this tool was the first tool that claimed to decrypt AACS protected titles. Now, they didn't provide any keys or information on how keys could be obtained, but that kickstarted a search with people trying to find any existing keys in the wild. And the first place they turned was the software players, PowerDVD and WinDVD. And this wasn't some crazy complex reverse engineering effort. No, they dumped the RAM while you put a movie in, you dump the RAM, and you just take what comes out and start searching for anything that might look like a key. And well, that worked. And soon a volume unique key was found, which allowed them to decrypt one disk. But finally, on February 11th, 2007, they found an actual processing key. And as we said, that allows pretty much all existing titles to be decrypted. And this is the, depending on how you look at it, the infamous 09F9 key. And a few days later, actual device key sets were found also in the RAM of WinDVD 8. And AACS confirmed the legitimacy of the revoked keys, of the leaked keys, and obviously revoked them. But this started an interesting cat and mouse game. Because PowerDVD and WinDVD need to now issue software updates so that all their other users still can watch their movies. But the pirates can dump and release the keys faster than AACS-LA can revoke them. Also, in a little bit of an ironic twist, one of the largest contributors to the AACS-LA group was Sony, and around this time, at a C3 talk actually, the PS3 root key was figured out. And considering that one of its selling points was that it is a Blu-ray player, the PS3 firmware updates also became a source of AACS keys. So let's look at some aftermath. The AACS-LA issued a statement that effectively boils down to, it's not our fault that your software left decrypted keys in RAM. And it's not actually a compromise of the AACS scheme or algorithm itself. And that is true, but the keys are still being dumped and published to this day, and they can't revoke them fast enough. So they effectively had to give up. And AACS-LA decided to go back to the drawing board for the upcoming Ultra HD 4K Blu-ray format that was coming out. And that finally brings us to AACS V2. So this was developed with the release of the Ultra HD 4K Blu-ray format, launched in 2008. The specifications are now under NDA. They decided they no longer want to tell people how it works. And of course, it requires purchasing new hardware players or disk drives here on PC. And interestingly, PC playback requires Windows on Intel 7th gen CPUs or newer. So why is that? Well, AACS V2 uses Intel SGX technology to guard its secrets. So if you are on Linux or AMD or ARM or anything that is not officially supported Windows on SGX supporting Intel 7th gen plus platforms, sorry, your movies will not work. So this is where we get involved. Attacks on SGX had largely been an academic or theoretic thing up to this point, and we want to find some consumer-facing usages of SGX tech in the wild and break them. And the most prolific use that we found was AACS V2. And what they do is that they hide the DRM code and all of the keys and secrets inside this SGX trusted enclave, which has prevented any analysis or compromises up to this point effectively. And it was implemented by Cyberlink, also in PowerDVD, starting with version 17. So let's do the obvious thing, buy a copy and reverse it. But before we can dive into PowerDVD itself, I want to take a quick detour and talk about SGX technology, since it's something that a lot of people might have heard of at some point, but it's not a very commonly used protocol. So what is Intel SGX? It stands for Software Guard Extensions, and it's a set of processor extensions developed by Intel that enables a hardware-backed trusted execution enclave. And you can kind of think of it like an inverse of the VM threat model. It's actually designed to protect sensitive code and data from higher privilege threats on your machine. So if you have your code running in an enclave, it's not only protected from the kernel, the hypervisor, even BIOS, SMM, or management engine, and even physical attacks on the machine, because any memory leaving the core is transparently encrypted on the fly. So SGX is also quite complicated, but I'll try my best to give a brief but sufficient overview. So how does this work? Well, you write C++ code as normal, but you can mark the trusted parts of the enclave as being trusted and to be put into SGX. And the SGX-aware compiler toolchain will lift those functions out and put them in the enclave, and then do all the transparent edge routines and call gate functionality for you. So for an enclave to work, it must be signed by its author. And you can use a self-signed certificate for local debugging, but for any production enclaves, you must obtain an Intel signed certificate. And once you have all this, you effectively have a fairly normal shared object or DLL that you can distribute along with the rest of your application binaries. So how does it actually work, though? Well, enclaves are launched with some special new instructions that Intel implemented. We have ecreate, which will actually create the enclave and set up its address space. And some other stuff like eadd, extend, which computes a SHA-256 over all of the enclave contents and pages. Einit, which will actually verify that the certificate used to sign the enclave is valid and you're not trying to do something like launch an enclave in production mode with a self-signed certificate. And eGetKey is a quite interesting one, which will derive and return a cryptographic key that you request based on a couple different types that you can choose from. And because it's Intel, it's microcode, but it's even worse. It's something called zoo code, which is almost like microcode, but it's actually like x86-64 code that they're calling from microcode, but it's not really x86-64. It's like a pseudo x86-64. It's very cursed. And Intel does not provide a ton of information on how it works, but we can only speculate. So once you have an enclave, now what? Well, the enclave API, it consists of eCalls and OCalls. An eCall just transfers your control into an enclave, and an OCall will transfer your control back out of an enclave. Interesting to note is that there are no syscalls. Intel did not want theoretical SGX malware to be deployed that can do all of its dirty work inside the enclave and prevent analysis. So because we have no syscalls, how can data be securely passed back and forth? Well, that brings us to SGX sealing. Secure data has to be sealed before leaving the enclave. And this sealed blob can be written to disk, non-volatile memory, passed around, whatever you want, and then later it has to be unsealed to recover the data in the enclave. And to do this, there's a special leaf for eGetKey called sealKey, which will do some microcode magic, derive the seal key, and return it to you. And then you can just throw that into AAS-GCM and do your crypto. The sealing key is derived from one of two measurements. There's a measurement called MR signer, which binds the sealing key to the enclave, any enclave signed by the same author certificate. And there's MR enclave, which binds the seal key to only an instance of that exact enclave, since it hashes the code and data sections. So let's take a look at PowerDVD. We got a copy of PowerDVD 20 Ultra, which was the newest at the time. And installing it and opening it up, we see there's like almost 900 megabytes, thousands of files, hundreds of folders. It's just a mess. And the actual application is just a wrapper, so we have to follow the rabbit hole down on the flow from trying to launch the application to actually playing a movie. And because it's a media player software, they take a lot of steps along the way to make sure you can't debug it, you can't inspect it, you can't analyze it. Well, eventually we find that PowerDVD movie.exe is the application that actually handles coordinating media playback and figuring out what types of codecs, files, decoders to load for a given media. And it's, in the case of Ultra HD Blu-ray, it loads the AACS V2 related modules when it detects that you put a UHD disk in the drive. So once it detects that you're trying to play back an AACS V2 protected title, it loads a couple of new DLLs that are responsible for actually doing the decryption. So we have CLTA, which stands for Cyberlink Trusted Agent, and it contains the implementation for the high-level implementation for all of the AACS V2 stuff. And it's protected by the Themida Packer and Obfuscator, which is the best in the business for binary protection, packing, obfuscation, code protection. They have every trick in the book, anti-debug, VM detection, control flow obfuscation, flattening. So it's a pain to look at. We find another DLL next to it, CLTASW, which I'm not really sure what it does, but it's okay because it's not used. CLKD, now this is the first enclave we encounter, stands for Cyberlink Key Downloader. And this is the enclave that actually performs the remote attestation to securely provision the keys into your machine. And CLTE, which is the trusted enclave, which is also an enclave. But this is the enclave that actually handles the operations of AACS V2, the decryption, decrypting the movie files, and passing them to like an HDCP compliant sync. And this is interesting because it's protected with something called Intel SGX PCL. So what is PCL? Well, if you think back to CLTA, well, I was able to strip the Themida protections from CLTA and de-obfuscate for reverse engineering, along with getting it patched to allow us to run it under a debugger. But CLT.dll is protected by PCL. So PCL is interesting because it encrypts the code and data sections on disk to prevent static analysis. And it wraps them with this little loader stub program that loads a sealed AES key from disk, decrypts it in place inside the enclave to protect it from dynamic analysis. And this PCL key is also not shipped with the software, but provisioned securely alongside the AACS V2 keys. So if you were able to somehow break the scheme and get the PCL key, then it doesn't really matter because you would have already broken enough to obtain the AACS keys anyway. And effectively, this gives you a black box, unauditable code blob that runs on your machine. There's no way, you can't see what it looks like statically, you can't see what it's doing dynamically. It's just a mystery black box that's in charge of doing all the DRM. So what actually happens when we play a movie? Well, we start with PowerDVD movie, and when it detects that we're trying to play an AACS V2 protected title, it'll try to go and check your system for SGX support. And if there's no SGX supported, then obviously we fail. And if it is supported, we load the CLTA, trusted agent, which will then handle the remaining AACS operations. First thing we'll do is check for a file on your disk called CLDshowX2, and this is the actual sealed blob that is stored on disk that will contain all the keys. Now, if it exists, we can go and load CLT directly, but if not, we'll actually have to download the keys into the platform. So then we load CLKDE, which will go and talk to the Cyberlink key server to securely provision the keys. And if something happens and it fails and we can't get keys, again, we must fail since there's nothing else we can do at this point without keys. If it does work, we download the keys, decrypt them, and seal them, and write them to this file. And then, again, transfer control to CLTE. That, upon starting, first runs the PCL wrapper stub, which will unseal the PCL key from this blob, decrypt the actual contents of the real CLTE enclave, and then that will finally talk to the Blu-ray drive, HDCP, and do the movie playback. But there was something interesting we noticed when we ran this on a machine that I had corrupted so bad that the SGX runtime just didn't work, that, well, the SGX support check failed, and it didn't exactly fail. Well, what it happened is that it loaded CLTASW instead, did something, and then failed. So It turns out that CLTA-SW doesn't just fail like this. It fails like this. So what is CLTA-SW? Well, let's load it into IDA. And well, what do we see? Uh-oh. No thumb IDA, no encryption, debug logging strings, and a lot of them. This is pretty much a nearly complete implementation of the AACS V2 algorithm. So we have no idea why or how this got here, and we're pretty sure it shouldn't be here. We hypothesized that it's a software-only implementation before they put it through the SGX compiler to lift out the trusted parts into enclaves, and they must have accidentally left in their production build. And makes me think back to this statement. I don't think this is compliant with the robustness rules set forth in the AACS license agreement, but I could be wrong. But this is really funny and cool, but even with the PCL protections rendered effectively useless by CLTA-SW, we're actually no closer to getting AACS keys. The CLD-SHOW-X2 file is not shipped as part of the software, but has to be securely provisioned into your system later through an online connection from their server and is only then sealed to disk. And that's the job of the CLKD enclave. So you might think we can just talk to the server and download a pre-sealed blob of keys, but you actually can't do that. Well, why? So to figure that out, we got to look a little bit deeper into SGX sealing. Well, all SGX keys returned from eGet key are derived from one of two master keys. There's something called the root provisioning key and the root sealing key. These keys are burned into eFuses during manufacturing, and the RPK is generated by Intel on a secure HSM, it's tracked in the database, and is linkable to CPUs. But the root seal key is randomly generated on the CPU itself at production time and is not known to Intel. So what does this actually mean for sealing? Well, the SGX sealing keys are derived from the root sealing key, as it sounds. But this means that the same enclave, meaning it has the same MR signer and MR enclave measurements, on a different CPU will derive a different sealing key from eGet key because it will have a different RSK. So this means that the sealed blobs only work locally on your machine and cannot be shared between physical CPUs. This is actually, it seems like a feature, right? Because data can't be sealed and exfiltrated by this hypothetical SGX malware, since that sealed blob will be useless once it's removed from the CPU that generated it. Trusted data can still be processed locally or into non-volatile storage. But that still raises the question that how can we provision the secure data into the enclave in the first place? So to do that, there's a mechanism Intel came up with called attestation. So SGX provides two mechanisms for enclaves to prove their security. There's local attestation on your machine, which is just a mutual authentication between two enclaves. And this could theoretically still be emulated locally if you implement the eGet key derivation yourself and just return junk but deterministic keys. But remote attestation is a little bit more interesting, since this authentication is between an enclave and a remote server, and it allows the remote server to provide the enclave with secrets. And this actually cannot be emulated by design. And this should solve the secure provisioning problem. So before we get to remote attestation, we got to look at local attestation. And I apologize, there's still some more terminology, but I'm trying to keep it as light as possible. So there's something called a report that is just a data structure containing the measurements from the enclave to be verified, like MR enclave, MR signer, and there's also some additional security state info in there. This can also include optional user data, like if you want to put some Diffie-Hellman parameters in there for your own future use. And the interesting part of a report is that it is signed with a CMAC signature, but using not the report key of the enclave that generates it, but the report key of the enclave that verifies it. And to do this, there's, of course, another instruction called ereport. And this will populate the report struct with measurements from the enclave that called it. And it can actually derive the verifying enclave's report key and sign the CMAC. So it doesn't actually give you the report key from the other enclave. It will, in one instruction, remember, populate the report struct, derive the key, compute the AES CMAC, and then give that back to you. So let's do a quick walkthrough just how this works, because this is a little bit confusing. Say we have two applications, A and B, and we'll call A the prover and B the verifier, although as you'll see, they prove and verify each other anyway. First step is that enclave B has to send over its MR enclave measurement to A, which will then create a report struct using this e-report instruction and the provided MR enclave. So the instruction will generate this report, derive the CMAC key, and calculate the signature. You can then send the report from enclave A to B. Now, to verify this report, all B has to do is simply call eGetKey with the report key type to get its own report key, and then it's a simple AES CMAC. And once that's verified, we just do this process in reverse. And you may note that MR enclave is not exchanged again, since we can just obtain A's MR enclave from the report that we just verified. Do the same process in backwards, send it back to A. It'll do the exact same verification, call eGetKey for its report key, compute and verify CMAC, and then we're all good. We're both running inside SGX, or an emulator. So to do this remotely, there's something called a quote, which is just a special type of report that has been locally signed in a remotely verifiable way. These quotes can be either fully anonymous or pseudonymous or linkable, which just means that the verifying server can detect if two quotes came from the same CPU. To do this, Intel implements something called an architectural enclave, which are a set of special enclaves authored by Intel that they delegate tasks to on your machine. And because they're signed by Intel's certificate, they are afforded some special privileges by the microcode. Mainly, they get access to a couple new eGetKey types. And this is on your machine as part of the SGX runtime services. And it's actually open source. You can check it out on GitHub, but only the Linux version, though. And we're on Windows, so that was a little bit annoying, but that was a fairly simple reverse engineering task. Now, I mentioned verifying and remote verification and certificates, but we want to do this in a privacy-preserving way. So Intel has a scheme called EPID, which is an asymmetric group signature scheme based on DAA that groups processors into groups based roughly on processor type. It's actually not fully known exactly how it works, but you can, for the sake of this talk, you can imagine that a CPU that, let's say, 7th gen i7, I don't think they had i9s, a 7th gen i7 is in a group of all other 7th gen i7s. So you have these large groups, and each CPU in a group holds its own private signing key. The public key holder, which is Intel, can only verify if a signature is valid and what group produced it, but not the actual individual member of that group. These are, of course, revocable. And there's three mechanisms Intel gives you to revoke. There's the group revocation list, if they have to revoke an entire group. A private key revocation list, which if someone leaks their EPID private keys, then they will simply be put on this revocation list. And a little bit more interestingly, the SIGRL, or signature revocation list, which is a list of base name signature pairs produced by a known bad member of this group. So if Intel knows that you were able to obtain your own private keys and sign things, but even if Intel can't figure out which private key you have, they can say that this pair of data and signatures produced by a bad member and must be revoked. Now, the actual architectural enclaves themselves, we have the provisioning enclave, which will interact with Intel server to do the protocol to actually join into this EPID group scheme. And it proves its authenticity to Intel using keys derived from the RPK fuses, and that's the mechanism that prevents emulation, since there's no way other than something like a management engine level exploit where code could otherwise access RPK fuses. And these keys are only accessible through enclaves that are signed with the special Intel cert. And the actual process is, again, more complicated crypto, so that's out of the scope for this talk. But the result is that you have this unique EPID private key blob that is then sealed to disk after you pass provisioning with this provisioning seal key. The more interesting enclave is the quoting enclave. This is what actually signs these reports into quotes. And since it's also signed by Intel, it also can derive the same PSK and unseal the EPID private key blob from your disk. To actually make a quote, we'll first do a local attestation to verify that the requester is in fact an enclave. And that also has the side effect of having a verifiable report already given to the QE. And then the QE will unseal the EPID private key, sign the report into a quote, and then, of course, encrypt it with the Intel RSA public key so that no one else can verify these quotes except Intel. And that's verifiable by Intel. There's also something called the Sigma protocol, which is just an enhanced version of elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman key exchange that has some additional authentication on there with CMAX to prevent any man-in-the-middle attacks. But the important part is that this is what actually guards the remote attestation messages going between the enclave and the server itself from someone trying to man-in-the-middle it. And since it's just JSON over HTTP, hopefully S, we want to prevent people from man-in-the-middling it. And the other feature of Sigma that's of note is that it allows you to derive some additional ephemeral session keys that you can then later on use after you pass attestation to encrypt the secrets in a way that both the server and the enclave can access them, and then that's how you actually download them into the enclave. So okay, that was a lot. Let's look at how this actually works in practice. We have our local platform running Cyberlink, and we have the Intel PSW architectural enclave runtime. And then on the right, we have the Intel server and the Cyberlink server that we'll be talking to. So before we do anything with Blu-rays, we need to join this EPID scheme if we haven't already and provision ourselves. So the provisioning enclave can do this provisioning protocol to do this join scheme, and if that passes, we're left with this EPID private key blob on disk. So later on, we're trying to watch a movie, and we realize that, hey, we don't have the secret keys yet in the CLD show X2, and we need to download them. So CLTA will fire up the key downloader enclave, which will then initiate the remote attestation process. First thing we do, for message 1, we get our group ID, we generate our Diffie-Hellman curve points, and you can also include some user data. And interestingly, Cyberlink includes some things like your serial number, your CD key, additional parameters of how you registered it, and some stuff from your platform. So they are able to actually trace back a specific license of PowerDVD to a remote attestation request. That's then sent to their server, which will store the parameters from the elliptic curve and prepare message 2. To do that, it will send its service provider ID and group ID to the Intel attestation service. It's kind of like its API key, which will then validate that the requester and obtain the revocation list for the group ID. That's sent back to Cyberlink. It'll generate its own curve points, and then derive the session MAC key, and then compute a CMAC over this as part of the authentication scheme so that you can't man-in-the-middle it. That's sent back to the enclave, which can now start to generate a quote. So, like we said, we first do a local attestation with the quoting enclave, which will verify a report and start the process to turn that report into a quote. It'll unseal the private key blob, produce a quote from the report, and you can think of it like resealing it and putting it back. We then encrypt the quote with the Intel attestation service RSA key, give that back to CLKD, who will just forward it on to Cyberlink, who has to then verify it by, again, forwarding it on to Intel. They can now finally decrypt this quote and verify, since they have the EPID group public keys. Once that's verified, it'll tell that to Cyberlink, who then checks a couple things. They check, is the quote actually authentic? Like, does it have a valid signature? They also check the MR signer and MR enclave measurements contained in the quote, since we want to make sure that you're not trying to do remote attestation with just a completely different enclave. Are there any interesting attributes enabled like debug, since we want to make sure debuggable enclave is not trying to connect and download keys. And they don't check if the secure, the TCB, which is effectively encodes security patch levels, they don't check if that's up to date. But we'll get back to why. Once that passes, we can finally do the last step of this process, encrypt the AACS key blobs and the PCL key, send that to the enclave, who can now decrypt it with the same ephemeral session key, and then finally seal that to disk. So okay, that was a lot. Let's attack this. So we're going to attack this based on the methods of frog and toad. So what are side channels? A side channel attack is some attack that leverages extra information that you can obtain from the target that is not necessarily a flaw in the algorithm itself, but a leak of information that is inherent to the actual implementation. You might have actually heard of some types of side channel attacks, like power analysis, timing analysis, electromagnetic leaks, but a lot of these happen on more embedded platforms like you might see on microcontrollers or simpler CPUs. Is something like Intel SGX vulnerable to side channels? Well, it turns out yes, a few of them. Yeah, this is a list of some of the possible attacks we can choose for extracting data out of Intel SGX or just Intel CPUs as a whole. But before we can go into the details, just a quick primer on how these cache-based side channels work using something called prime and probe. With prime and probe, we have a victim thread and an attacker thread running on a physical core with some cache and some much slower RAM somewhere outside of the core. First thing we need to do, allocate a cache size buffer and RAM. We then prime the cache to set it to a known state and remove the junk that's unpredictable based on what was running before by accessing all of the elements to fill it with the buffer contents. We then sit there and wait for the victim to do something that accesses RAM. And when it accesses RAM, it'll leave an imprint in the cache. Now we can't read the cache directly, but we can probe the cache by measuring the access time. And since the RAM is much slower than the core, accessing an element in our buffer that is no longer cached, which is the blue square, we'll have to go and defer to RAM, which is much slower, and we can measure the difference in the access time. So this is then extended to an attack called Meltdown, which uses these cache side channels to exploit another hardware vulnerability in Intel processors that just lets an attacker completely bypass all memory protections on a CPU. You can dump kernel memory from userland in 3 lines of code, effectively. And it's a speculative execution class vulnerability. What's happening under the hood is that if you do a faulty load of data that you don't have access to, it'll crash with an access violation that you would expect. But interestingly, that data actually exists in the context of the speculative window before that crash happens. So the data should be lost when the crash is retired and the window is rewound, destroying the data. But it turns out it can be leaked in the meantime with cache-based side channels. So to extend this to SGX, we use an attack called Foreshadow, which is just Meltdown with some extra virtual memory tricks to extend it to reading data out of SGX. But we have this Foreshadow leak, but what do we actually leak? Even if PCL was not undermined by Cyberlink themselves, attacking the enclave is unnecessarily slow and hard. We could attack CLKDE, but that requires a copy of PowerDVD and Windows to be installed on every machine we have to run the attack on. And we also didn't want to deal with the Windows virtual memory management. Much easier would be the quoting enclave, since, well, it has access to the EPID private key, and we'd only need to leak the 128 bits of the secret seal key. And that's exactly what we did. So what do we do now that we have these EPID private keys? Well, first attack we can do is implement a rogue quoting enclave. I wrote a shim program that sits between the Cyberlink enclaves and the real Intel enclaves that intercepts the whole attestation flow from CLKDE. And instead of loading the real Intel quoting enclave, it will call my evil quoting enclave instead. Unlike Intel's quoting enclaves, mine will sign anything, and it allows me to patch CLKDE. Normally, you couldn't do that since you'd have to re-sign it with your certificate, and that would change MR Signer, MR Enclave, it would have debug mode enabled, but because my evil quoting enclave will sign anything, and also we don't care about local attestation, I can just patch the quote values for MR Signer and MR Enclave before signing to what they should be, sign them with the extracted EPID private key, and you make an enclave that's remotely indistinguishable from the original thing. Now, what can we do with this? Well, SGX uses RDRAN to generate the cryptographically secure curve points when they're doing the elliptic curve handshake. It's supposed to look like this. You can see it reading RDRAN values, and that's what it's going to use to generate the GAX, GAY curve points. Well, mine looks like this. I call it Sony mode. So now that we know the Diffie-Hellman secret A and the server's GBX, GBY points, it's trivial to compute the ephemeral session key. And once we have the session key, that's what's actually encrypting the AACS keys in the JSON. So let's look at the message 4 that we get. Well, it should be JSON, but it's not. It's just a random blob. And it turns out, doing some more reverse engineering, there's an equal5 in CLKD that, for whatever reason, has some hard-coded AES wrapper around it. But luckily for us, the keys in IV are hard-coded in CLKD and also CLTASW for good measure. So applying that, we can finally decrypt the message 4 into valid JSON like we expected, and this now contains 4 keys. AACS2 device keys. There's another scheme called Blu-ray BD+, which is at something completely different and is not used here. The keys are there, but they're blank, so we can just effectively ignore those. And the PCL key that we talked about. Since we have the session key trivially computable, we can just decrypt them from these base64 blobs, and that gets us an entire set of 253 AACSv2 device keys and the PCL key. Let's try something else. This is a good proof of concept, but this, again, still requires SGX on this platform. It requires PowerDVD. It requires Windows. Since we're still running the actual PowerDVD software enclaves, we're just messing with the quotes. But since we have the EPID private key, we can just emulate remote attestation in its entirety. So that's what I did. I implemented a CLKD functionality, the quoting enclave functionality, and all of the EPID crypto in Python. So if you can run Python, congratulations, you're now an authentic Intel SGX secure enclave. I have a demo. So this is, as you may notice, is running on a Raspberry Pi, which does in fact support Python, and I don't think I need to convince you does not in fact support Intel SGX technology. But we have our private keys, so let's run the implementation. So we'll do a few things. Generate our curve points, send that off to the server. They'll reply. We now derive the ephemeral session keys, magic up a quote, send that off. That'll then be sent to Intel, who will verify it and say, yep, looks good. And then once we get that, we got our message 4, decrypted with all the keys that we know how to get, and that gets us a nice blob of AACS keys, Blu-ray BD plus 2 keys that don't exist, and our PCL key for good measure. Oops. So okay, now we have all this, we have the keys, we have the PCL key, we have the enclaves decrypted. Let's take a look inside. Well, reversing it, the real CLT reveals that it's actually pretty much the exact same thing as AACS V1. just slightly updated with some new crypto ciphers and a couple very similar, just new MKB entries. Instead of SHA-1, they use SHA-256, so that's nice. Instead of their custom 190-bit ECC curve, they have a standard prime 256. All the AES-based hashes still remain. And they have the exact same subset difference tree system for revocation, just with, obviously, new device keys. But something interesting is that software players no longer share one common key, like you had back in the day where WinDVD had its one key that all the users shared. Because of the linkable EPID quotes, PowerDVD can actually issue a unique set of AACS keys for a given EPID signature. And that allows not only AACS to figure out who leaked stuff, they can revoke just you and leave all the other users unharmed without them also having to update everything. There's also, I should mention AACSv 2.1, which is practically an always-online DRM scheme that has never been implemented, so there's no real way to investigate how it works. And also with AACSv 2.1, there is something interesting they do where they actually encode bits of your key set that can uniquely identify you and your CPU into which chunks of video it decrypts. So you can think of it like a watermarking scheme, but it's a lot more interesting since you might think, okay, well, what if I just point my phone at the screen? That won't survive re-encoding. So what they came up with is a scheme where you can, instead of just doing invisible watermarks, we just do visible watermarks. Imagine two scenes rendered where in one scene there's, something happens with a character, but in another scene, the exact same thing happens, but there's a little glimmer in their eye. Congratulations, you just encoded one bit. If you do that enough times, you have a trader tracing scheme that can reveal from just a video file, and a very rough video file at that, enough key bits to see who is leaking their content. So as I'm going to have a second demo, since it's so similar, I could just patch the VLC libacs plugin with the new types used in V2 and run it on an RPi4 to play a movie. And you can do that just by putting our keys that we downloaded into the standard KeyDB config format. Unfortunately, my drive decided to die a couple hours ago. I know, I'm really sad too, because I have all these movies that we used to test with that I've never watched more than 5 seconds of the intro with. So I guess they'll have to wait a little bit later. But to make it up to you, I have 2 more special gifts that have never before been seen in the wild. We have proof of an authentic V2 media key and proof of an authentic V2 processing key, which, again, could render the entire system of UHD disks completely decryptable. So real quick, let's talk about some possible mitigation strategies. You may remember that the Cyberlink server does not verify if the platform requesting attestation is actually fully up to date, because even though IS will try to help them out and say that, hey, you're out of date if there's known vulnerabilities in that CPU, well, could they just choose to only trust up-to-date platforms? Well, maybe, but it's not that simple. See, unlike SGX used in enterprise applications, these platforms are owned by users. And users are not famous for being quick to update their BIOSes and microcode. But what if we just force them to? Well, some other members of the SGX.fail team scraped BIOS updates from 6 major vendors, ASRock, HP, MSI, Gigabyte, Lenovo, and Dell should be in there. Yeah. And among those, we found 173,000 microcode updates with about 5,300 related to SGX vulnerabilities that could undermine attestation. But the median patch time for some of these vulnerabilities range from anywhere from like 25 days to 125 days, with a median of that around 52. And well, this is difficult to detect from just scraping BIOSes since their formats are so non-standardized and not really easy to unpack. But we theorize that a lot of these older products just might never receive a patch at all. So in effect, AACS-LA gets to choose between having some insecure users or no users at all. And to this end, we say farewell to SGX on consumer platforms since Intel is killing it on 11th gen. After a laundry list of vulnerabilities that undermine SGX security, they decided it's just not worth it trying to support it for consumer platforms, and starting from 11th gen, it's gone. And yeah, thank you. So some takeaways. Once again, we are back at the same cat and mouse game where AACS keys can be dumped theoretically faster than being revoked. Because as long as I can buy, or someone can buy, $10 vulnerable i3 7100 on eBay versus who knows how much it costs to remaster every single disk being made, well, that's an imbalance, that's an asymmetric amount of effort, time, and money. And also, technical mitigation is not really a solution if it destroys the service. AACS-LA sure could choose to only trust fully up-to-date platforms, but what remains then from all your potential users that are still buying physical media UHD disks? Has the whole scheme, invest in Windows, invest in Intel, and also have fully patched platforms. And this also proves that side channel attacks are not just something theoretical in academic papers and labs. This can be practically exploited in the wild on end user devices quite very simply. And also, please verify that you're not shipping your internal debug tools in production. And finally, like we said, with Intel SGX being removed from newest 11th Gen Plus platforms, well, people upgrading their CPUs that still want to watch their Blu-ray collection, that will be left as an exercise for the reader. So, special thanks to the entire SGX.fail team. Bader, who from Purdue, worked very closely with me with reverse engineering, decrypting movies, figuring out the triangles. Stefan from Michigan, who is a wizard at Intel, caching, side channels. Daniel Genkin, who was my advisor for the team at Michigan, who's now at Georgia Tech. Christina Garman, crypto expert at Purdue, who also helped us understand the four-dimensional triangles. And the rest of the team, working on some other parts of the SGX.fail paper, which you can read at, just type in your browser SGX.fail. There's some other interesting stuff we do in there, like breaking secret network cryptocurrency, I should say. And then also Dennis, were you? Yeah, for being the absolute hero that tried to get the last demo to work by taking the train to MediaMarkt to get a replacement drive that didn't work. Thank you. And thank you.
Thank you, Adam. We might get one question through Signal Angel. Would you mind?
Yeah. Doesn't the DVD industry try to backpedal on the CSS breach with weak sectors and other methods to deter ripping? Did the Blu-ray disc industry ever try similar?
Yes. So, can everyone hear the question? So the question was, with CSS, when the compromises were published, the manufacturers tried some other mechanisms, like weak sectors and some other things, to try to patch up what they had left. Did Blu-ray try anything similar? With Blu-ray or AACS V1, they did. There's like other forms of DRM that can be stacked on top of AACS. That was the aforementioned BD+. That's like it's implemented in Java with Blu-ray that tries to do some more DRM. That was not implemented here since this has not been broken yet. And there's also something called Synavia, another type of DRM. So yes, you can stack different DRMs on top of AACS. They did do that with V1, but since V2 has not yet really been broken, they have not done that.
Thanks a lot, Adam. Please give him a huge round of applause for this very, very interesting talk.